I'm gonna start this with a little disclaimer. This video is called Collapse into Nothing, but by doing this, I'm not trying to bash REM. I'm not a big fan of the band, but I do have a lot of respect for REM and for Michael Stipe in particular. So this is not a video against REM, sorry. They recently came out with a new album called Collapse into Now. The reviews are good, the fans are happy with it, so I'm not going to touch the subject. Just saying, this video has little to do with that. There are other reasons why I decided to call it Collapse into Nothing, and we'll get into them in a few seconds. What I want to talk about in this video is big old bands and what their presence in the market, in the music market, and in the live music market does to the music environment in general, and especially for the genre of rock music, rock and roll. So, in my opinion, despite my being a big fan of music, rock music, especially from the 70s, the fact that most of the old bands from the 70s and the 80s are now back together and touring, and some of them even making new records, is not quite beneficial for rock music. And why do I say this? Because the way things used to be back then, back in the 70s and 80s, bands would get together, eventually, if they were lucky, become famous, have like a number of albums out, say, from a minimum of 1 or 2 to a maximum of, let's say, 10 to 12. And then they would eventually stop, and each member would go their separate ways and move on with their career or start new projects and all. And during that lifetime of the band, which would be between like 10 to 15 years if the band was lucky, then they would be touring around the world and make big concerts in stadiums and summer festivals, anything. So, what were the benefits of the old ways? And I mean the ways when a band that was 10 to 15 years old would retire and eventually stop making the music they were making and go their separate ways, or, I don't know, stay at home with their families if they were done making music. The first benefit that I can think of is the affirmation, the explosion, if you want, of new styles. Rarely in rock history a famous band especially, has been able to be successful and express themselves in more than one style. So if you keep the same band on the scene for like 30, 40 years, I doubt that if that band stays successful throughout their career, I doubt they're going to promote anything different from what they did, in their first decade, right? So that's one thing. And the other thing is that if you keep the same guys on the scene for like 40 years, how do you expect new musicians to become famous, to become successful? So, if you still have Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, making big bucks, making huge concerts, filling up stadiums and whatnot, how do you expect, 18-year-old rockers of 2011 to become famous and become the new Rolling Stones? Personally, I would prefer, rather than becoming the new Rolling Stones, that they became the new themselves and within, the universe of rock music, make something new, make something different that hasn't been made. So I remember this great interview of Steve Harris. Steve Harris, the bass player and leader of Iron Maiden, this iconic band of heavy metal from the 80s. And again, I've always had a lot of respect for them. I've just never been a huge fan. But so this was an interview in the early or mid 90s, I guess, that I read on Metal Hammer or some magazine like that. And at some point, this brave journalist asked this question, Steve Harris. Steve, do you think there is still room in the rock scene for Iron Maiden? Do you think Iron Maiden is still like 1990s material? And the answer Steve Harris gave to that was something that left an impression on me, because he said, that's a bitter pill that I'm not quite ready to swallow, I think. So Steve Harris didn't say, oh yeah, I think Iron Maiden is always necessary and will always be necessary. He said that, well, maybe eventually Iron Maiden will fall out of fashion and new people, new styles will take over. But, this is what I like to do. This is my job. So as long as I can get out there and, make people happy, make fans happy, and, make new records that I'm happy with, then I'd like to keep doing it, even though, I know that at some point I will fall out of fashion and my music will become the music for old people. So I think a lot of musicians who are old musicians, who are out there touring and making records now, should think the same thing that Steve Harris was thinking for that interview, which I remind you is like 15, 16 years old. Think about how they like making records and, how they like making their music on the one hand, and how by doing that, and by doing that at the scale they're doing it, they might be impeding the evolution of rock music. And natural consequence of that, in my opinion, is that rock and roll will become more and more a genre for older people. So I see less and less 20-year-olds or like teenagers being interested in rock and roll these days. And the reason is the big bands, the bands that fill stadiums nowadays, are not bands made of 20 or 18-year-olds. They are the big old bands that mom and dad used to listen to, bands from the 80s or the 70s even. So I think all these old great musicians that we all love to listen to should think about stepping down, and the music business itself should think about, how to revitalize rock and roll and favor the emergence of new styles, within rock and roll. And that's done only, in my opinion, that's done only by letting younger people take the stage, take the scene. So, yeah, if this doesn't happen, in my opinion, rock and roll will become and stay a genre for old people. And that means that, old people will eventually, pass away, and so will rock music. So, you don't want rock music to collapse into nothing, do you? Then, if you're a rock fan like me, then you should think about it, and you should focus your attention on who's trying to renew the scene and renew the genre, right? Yes, it is exciting to know that the bands that you used to like when you were a teenager, I don't know, R.E.M., Guns N' Roses, whatever, are still around and they're touring and it's exciting to go to their concerts. But before you put that money on that, I'd recommend that you check the scene for new styles, for new people, and try to support them instead. Because, yeah, REM is great. They don't need any support, whereas newer bands, newer people, they need a lot of support to become famous and get their name out there. So think about it and try to prevent rock from collapsing into nothing. All right? Talk to you guys soon. Take care. Bye-bye.